everyone, welcome back to Beyond Nihility. In this video, we're going to be continuing with the attributes that we have in Brush Studio. So let's get the video started. So I'm going to click on any of the brushes that we already have and try to open the brush interface. So in the last video, we tried discussing about the stroke path and stabilization. I hope this is clear with you. If not, please let me know on how I can help you understand these better. Let me know in the comment section. With that being said, let's move on to the next two attributes that we have, which is taper and shade. So what is taper? So taper is kind of like an attribute that sort of reduces the thickness of your brush and makes it more narrower towards the beginning or the end of the brush. By utilizing the properties that are given for taper, you can create sort of like the natural finish to your brushes like you get with the real life brushes that are there, which are sort of thicker at the base and they start tapering at the end. So under taper, you have several categories. One is pressure taper, there's touch taper, and there's something called as taper properties. You can see that there are sort of like similar properties under pressure taper as well as touch taper. Well, the only difference is pressure taper is purely for your pencil. If you use a pencil to draw something on Procreate, that's when the pressure taper will come into picture. And then there's touch taper, which will sort of help you taper your strokes if you draw with your finger. So the first thing you have under pressure taper is this particular slider, if you say, where you can sort of control if the taper should be at the extreme left or extreme right of your strokes. So these two sliders will help you determine where the tapering should actually start. So for example, I have set the taper towards the left, and if I try to draw a stroke, you can see that it's kind of pointy over here. Let me reduce it and probably show it like this. Yeah, so if you can see that there's the taper only at the beginning, and at the end I do not have any taper because I've set it to extreme right. If I observe the stroke as I move the slider over here, so I'm gonna reduce the taper towards the beginning and I'm gonna add the taper towards the end by using these sliders. So there's this option to set both of them at a certain point. That means both of your starting point and the ending point of the stroke should have equal amount of taper. If you want to set such kind of taper to your brushes, there's this option called link tip sizes. So what this will do is if I move any one of the slider to extreme left or right, the right one will also move by the same offset or the same distance over here. Next property that you have is the size. So size will help you determine how dramatic the taper should be. So here it's set to maximum. That means that the tapering is sort of starting from this particular point. And as you can see, there's like very dramatic. Sorry, I'm just gonna draw another one. Yeah, you see that it's kind of like way too dramatic over here, the tapering. So it's becoming extremely narrow from sort of like this point. So if you set it to minimum or if you set it to none, that means that I am not setting any taper basically. So the next property that we have is opacity. Opacity basically helps set the opacity. I know. So it basically helps you determine how faded the taper should look like, or rather how faded the end of the stroke should look like. So I have my taper size set to maximum over here, and if I try to increase the opacity to maximum, you can see that, I'm not sure if you'll be able to notice on the camera, but then the end points of the taper are sort of like faded a little bit. In order to show that better, I'll probably decrease the size of the taper. If you see that the end of the stroke is sort of faded, so opacity will try to give you that natural feeling that as in when you're about to lift the brush, the amount of paint that is there also reduces. So opacity will basically give that touch to your brush in Procreate. So the next property that we have is pressure. So pressure will help you set the taper based on the pressure that you put on your pencil on the canvas. So for you to notice the pressure over here, there is one more attribute where you need to actually set the pressure sensitivity to max or to some value. Only then you'll be able to see the taper based on the pressure. I've changed that to max now, and then if I come back to taper attribute, if I increase and decrease the pressure, you can see how much it is affecting our taper over here. That means if I put a lot of pressure, the taper won't be there. If I reduce the pressure by a little amount, the taper is starting there. Now, this particular property is like a differentiator, if you call, between the touch taper and pressure taper, because in touch taper, except for the pressure, you have almost all the properties that are there in pressure taper as well. So the next property that is there is the tip. The tip will determine how sharp your taper should be. Like for example, if I draw a stroke over here, and if I increase the tip to sort of like extreme, it says that it is blunt. So this sort of gives that effect of a chunky brush, if you would say, to your strokes. So if I reduce the tip slider over here, that means that I'm setting the taper to be very, very sharp to give that fine tip. If I set it to maximum, it means that the taper should be very blunt. So the next property that we have is the tip animation. So tip animation is purely for the feel and it doesn't exactly affect the result of the strokes. So what happens is, if you set the animation to on, it means that while drawing a stroke, you can actually see the process of tapering happening over your canvas. And if you set the animation to off, you won't see the process, but then just the result. It's more of like the snappier version of your taper. I'll try to show that to you guys. I've set the tip to sharp and I'll try to draw a stroke. So it's almost showing me the tapering on how it's happening. But if I turn this to off, it's more of like a snappier look. This is not much noticeable on the camera, but if you try it by yourself, you can see that at one point you'll see that there's no taper. The moment you just draw a stroke, there will be taper. So all these properties are basically when you draw a stroke using your pencil. Now the touch taper that we have is basically the same set of attributes except the pressure again, because we're going to be drawing with our fingers. So to show that, I'm going to clear a drawing pad. And I've set again, this sort of slider works the similar way as in we have with the pencil. It will help you determine where your tapering should start. And the size will help you determine how much dramatic your transition should be from thick to thin. And then you have opacity that kind of fades the taper at the end. And then the tip will help you determine how sharp or how blunt your taper should be. So let's draw something with our fingers to help you better understand how the taper works like with the touch. So I'm just gonna draw something like this, and if you see that there's taper that is set at the beginning, at the end, so you can see that there's taper at the beginning and at the end. The size will again help you determine how dramatic the transition should be from thicker to thinner ends. If you see the opacity, it again works the similar way as in with the pencil. It fades a little bit at the end if I increase the opacity to max. And then we have tip. Here it is set to sharp, so my tips are kind of sharp. If I increase the tip, it becomes blunt. So the next property that we have under taper is the taper properties itself. So we have an option called classic taper. It was sort of really hard to understand how the tapering works like if you set the classic taper to on. I got to know that this basically brings the older version of tapering. In the earlier version of the Procreate, the tapering was added at the beginning as compared to end. So I'm just gonna clear this one and we'll show you. Can you see that over here? It's kind of like tapered at the beginning. So if I turn it to off, it means that I'm bringing like the newer version of the tapering, which is I want a little bit of taper at the beginning as well and at the end as well. So all these properties that are there, they kind of behave a little different when you turn this on. So I would recommend you to check all these properties again, and will recommend you to turn it off and then recheck all these properties again to understand better. So that was all about taper. So the next attribute that we have is shape. While tapering works at the stroke level on how your stroke should look like, shape is something that works at the level of each stamp that will combine as one stroke. In order to understand a little better, we'll first go to stroke path that we already learned, and we'll increase the spacing to 50, around 50. So now we'll go through each of these properties over here and we'll try to understand how they affect each of the particles. So first thing we have is shape source. Shape source is something which will help you define the shape of the stamp. So you have this option over here that is edit. So if you click on the edit, it will bring you to the shape editor. Here you have three options: import, cancel and done. So the import option, if you click on it, you do get these 3 or even 4 options that are there. First one is importing from a photo. So this will help you import any particular source that you have in your photo library of your iPad. So if you have something that you can import from the photos, you can click this option to import it. Next one we have is import from a file, which will help you import a shape if it's in a file format. And the next one we have is source library. So if you click on source library, there are already many shapes that are given by the Procreate app itself, wherein you can check on which one is suitable for your brush and select something from the source library. And then if you have any other shape that is sort of copied to the clipboard, you can use paste to import it from the clipboard itself. For example, I'm just gonna go to source library and will choose something like this, or maybe even a hexagon from the source library. So there are 2 things that you have to take care after you import from source library or photo or a file. That is to always invert the image. So what happens sometimes is if you import a particular photo or from a clipboard, it usually sort of has like a background to it. What happens if it has a background is, so for example here my hexagon shape that I have is in black and the background is sort of like white. So if I click on done and try to draw something over here, I better increase the spacing a little more for you to understand. And if I see that it sort of has like this sort of like black background, like a square pixel, but I do not want that. I want my stamps to be, well, if this is what you prefer, then you can definitely set it to this. I just want hexagonal shapes and I do not want any square shape around the hexagon. So what I'm gonna do is, if I click on the edit option again and if I tap it with 2 fingers, it means that my image is sort of inverted now. It means the hexagon that I have is kind of transparent. So if I click on done, as you can see, it has already changed. I only have hexagon and I do not have that weird square shape around it. So that was one thing to take care while importing a shape from external sources. The second thing is you also have an option to rotate your shape. For example, I can set it to something like this, or I want something like this. All you have to do is sort of rotate using your 2 fingers in the shape editor. To show that a little better, I'll take something that is not uniform. Yeah, let's go with this sort of like a lightning bolt shape. So this is set to transparent now, and so if I leave it without rotating, I have something like this. The angle of the shape is not changing, but if I want it to be horizontal, I can just do this and then click on done. You can see that the angle of the shape has changed. So that's how you modify the shape of the stamp. Now, while shape source will tell you how your shape should look like, input style is something that will tell you how each of the stamp should behave like. You have these sort of like 4 options over here. One is grayed out because that will be turned on only when you have one of the other options turned on. So we'll go through each of them. First one is touch only. If this one is selected, then you'll be able to change the rotation of the stamps that you have over here, because if you do not click the touch only options, and then in the next section you won't be able to vary any of the values under rotation. So in order to demonstrate that, I'm just gonna draw a stroke, or maybe decrease the spacing a little and decrease the jitter. So this is the stroke that I have. Come back to shape, and I've set it to touch only now. So now it will let me edit the rotation of each of the stamps. So as you can see, as in when I'm moving the slider, the stamps are sort of rotating. So if this is set to positive 100%, this will basically follow the stroke. That means however I've moved my pencil, that is how the angle of the stamps will be changed. If I set it to negative, it means that it will be inverted. So it won't follow my stroke anymore. It will turn exactly in the opposite way I've drawn my stroke. Next property that we have is azimuth. So azimuth is exclusively for Apple Pencil. If you have this option turned on, it will basically rotate the particles based on the angle you hold your pencil. And if you have azimuth turned on, then no matter how much rotation angle that you set, it will be overwritten. So to understand a little better, I'm just going to leave it to touch only, and I'm going to give various angles to my stroke using the pencil. So let's have something like this and something like this. And if I turn on the azimuth, you can see that these are sort of moving the way I have moved my pencil. This is really helpful if you are planning to create a watercolor brush. So it will basically create patterns based on how you move your pencil to sort of give that same feeling as you do with the watercolor brushes on paper. Now, Azimuth works with all generations of Apple Pencil, but then there is the next option, which is Azimuth and Barrel Roll. Barrel Roll, wow, what a tongue twister. So Barrel Roll will come into picture only if you've got a pencil which supports the barrel roll. I'm using the Apple second generation pencil. I do not have the barrel roll functionality in my pencil, so I won't be able to demonstrate. Since I do not have the pencil that supports the barrel roll, no matter if I turn it on or off, it will basically be considered as Azimuth instead of Azimuth barrel roll. So for example, if you turn the Azimuth barrel roll, you have the option to change stroke, like relative to stroke or non-relative to stroke. Since my pencil does not support this functionality, so it will just be overridden to the properties that are there in Azimuth. So I will leave a couple of links that I'll be adding in the description where you can go and check how the Azimuth and barrel roll works with the pencils that support barrel roll. So the next one is touch properties. As I said, this will work only if you have the touch only set to on. So setting it to positive 100, that means that you want your particles to follow the stroke. And if you set it to negative value, then you want your particles to go in the opposite direction of your stroke. So in order to go to the next set of properties that we have, I'm just going to clear the drawing pad and we'll set the rotation back to 0. The next set of properties that we have is shape properties. The first one is scatter. To understand this a little better, I'm just going to draw a stroke. And if I increase the scatter, you see that the angle of each particle, the particles are sort of rotated in different directions. So if I set the scatter to 0, that means that there's no change in the particles. In order to understand the next two properties that are there, that is count and count jitter, you need scatter to be set to some value so that you'll be able to clearly notice the difference on what happens if we increase or decrease the count. So I'm just going to draw a stroke over here. So you can see that each of my stamp is just 1. When I moved my pencil, it has stamped only once at every point. What happens is if I increase the count to like 5. So at each point, the stamps that are drawn using the pencil have stamped like 5 times. So the next option, count jitter, will basically add the randomness to the number of stamps that are presented at each point. So for example, if I set the count jitter to max, it means that ranging from 1 to 5, at each point it can either stamp itself once or twice or up to 5 times. If I reduce the count jitter, there won't be any changes. The next property that we have is randomized, flip X and flip Y. So these will help you determine the rotation of each of your stamp. So if you set it to randomize, if you turn the randomized on, the stamps will sort of be rotated into random angles. So I'll turn this off. I'll also turn off the scatter and we'll see how the flip X and flip Y would work. So flip X and flip Y will help you set the angle either to horizontal or vertical. So your each stamp will either be rotated to horizontal or vertical based on what you have set here. The next thing we have is pressure roundness gap. If you sort of like use these two blue points, as in when you bring them closer to each other, it means that you're kind of crushing your stamps. If you move them away, they won't be crushed or squashed anymore. There's also this green dot that will help you determine each stamp's angle. You can also use other option to change the roundness of your brush. That is, there is an option to change the roundness of each stamp based on the pressure. For example, if I put more pressure, there won't be much of that squashy effect on each of your stamp. If I reduce it or if I set it to negative value, it means that based on pressure, I want the stamps to be squished a lot more. So the next property that we have is tilt roundness. So tilt roundness will help you determine how your stamp should look like based on how you've tilted your pencil. For example, I've tilted it like this, and then I've tilted it like this. Let's see what effect it has on the stamp if I increase the tilt roundness. So if I sort of set it to negative value, you can see that there's much more of that squashing effect that's happening wherever I've tilted my pencil more. And if I set it to 0, there won't be any tiltness. And if I increase it wherever there is less tilt, I want that squishy effect. Next we have shape filtering. So we have three options in shape filtering. So shape filtering basically sets the anti-aliasing for your shape. So it will help you determine how soft or how harsh the edges must be. So let's go through each of them. So for example, I've set the shape filtering to no filtering. That means I want the edges of this particular shape to be a little rough. So as you can see over here, the shape is not exactly smooth. It's a little, there are sort of like edges to the shape which are not even. Now if I set it to classic filtering, it sort of creates like soft edges to my shape and will help look the shape to be much more smoother. So the improved filtering is something that has been introduced in the much recent versions of Procreate. So as I can see on the screen, when I set the improved filtering, I can see that the shape is somewhat like very natural. It's not too soft or it's too hard. So with this, we have covered all the properties that are there in taper and shape. So I hope you try out both of these things that we have learned by yourself so that you'll understand it much more nicely. So with that being said, if you have made it this far for the video, then please consider subscribing to the channel, and if you have got any more suggestions on how I can improve my videos, then please let me know in the comment section. So we'll meet again in the next video where we'll be discussing next set of properties that are there in the Brush Studio. So until then, take care, bye bye.